The rivalry is back on.
What's going on, everybody? This is Derek Larger here. Welcome back to the Cody Felger podcast. Andrew's with me today, and right now, the Colts just won against the Texans. That's right, folks. The Colts are now 4-2 with a 2-0 in the division record. We are now sitting at atop the AFC South right now. Definitely feels like a great momentum swing. We all mentioned how this was a pivotal game to win for this Colts team going into this, what we call easier part of the schedule here. It certainly was really great for me. I was psyched the whole way. Andrew, what were your quick thoughts on some quick impressions about it?
Yeah, yesterday's win was phenomenal, Derek. I mean, 4-2 on the season, 2-0 in the division, as you mentioned. And that'll come in handy later down the road when we get into some later divisional games. But being 2-0 certainly does help. You look at the offensive line, they did a phenomenal job in pass protection. The running game, as you mentioned, wasn't really exactly where we hoped it'd be, but it's those kinds of games from Jacoby Brissett, the 326 yards, 4 touchdowns, nearly 69% completion percentage on the day, that makes you wonder if we're looking at our new franchise quarterback. And I know we'll touch on him more later, but when the running game isn't really where we want it to be, or it's not, the Colts are unable to establish any sort of a running game, it's comes in really handy when Jacoby Brissett can step up and put the team on his back and lead the Colts to a win. And I think that's exactly what he did yesterday.
Absolutely. And when we get into this game here, I think it only makes sense that we dive into Jacoby Brissett first. I think it only seems fair that we talk about the guy who we talked about so much. He needed to step up and do what needed to be done, especially when the running game for the Colts took a step back this week. Not necessarily that the Colts couldn't get anything going. They did have a few runs where they were able to get some decent chunks of yards. Just ultimately, the yard totals weren't there. It wasn't as much of an emphasis on running the football because I think Reich knew the Texans were going to try to stamp on that. And he was right. The Texans brought a lot of pressure and a lot of guys in the box to stop that run. And they went against it. Actually, I think they said of their first 10 plays, 8 of them were actually passes. So the Colts came out firing on all cylinders with the throwing. And my goodness, Jacoby Brissett had himself a day. Set a career high in passer rating. I believe it was a 126.7, a career high in yards, 326, and a career high in touchdowns with 4. Andrew, I was insanely impressed with Jacoby Brissett today, not just because of the throws he was making and the reads that he was making, but just his ability to sit in the pocket and get out of the pocket and take hits and still deliver perfect throws to every receiver he threw it to. It really makes you feel really good knowing that Jacoby Brissett felt so comfortable, and we won this game mainly by his hand.
Absolutely, Derek. I couldn't have said it any better myself. As I mentioned earlier, looking at the numbers, 326 yards, nearly 69% completion percentage, 4 touchdowns. He put the team on his back on a day where the running game wasn't really where we would have expected it to be. The receivers did a phenomenal job. Frank Reich did a phenomenal job putting everybody in the right position to be successful. And the offensive line, I mean, we've praised and praised and praised for weeks and really since last year. And they deserve so much credit as well for giving Brissett a clean pocket. I think he was only sacked once, but nonetheless, he was very, very, very impressive. Now 14 touchdowns to only 3 interceptions on the season. He's looking, and I don't want to jump ahead, if you will, but it seems to me that we may have found a new franchise quarterback in Jacoby Brissett.
Absolutely. It was a great way to see him progress the way he did. And obviously, it wasn't all Jacoby Brissett. His wide receivers made it really good for him today. T.Y. Hilton, Zach Pascal, Jack Doyle, Nyheim Hines, and, of course, our man Eric Ebron. Every single one of these guys had themselves a terrific day. Chester Rogers had himself a few catches. I could just keep going with this list. I think they said Jacoby completed a pass to 8 different receivers today. So it certainly was good to see him distribute the wealth, and not just to a bunch of different guys. A lot of these guys had a bunch of good stats. I know T.Y. Hilton had 7 catches for over 70 yards and a touchdown. Ebron had himself 6 catches for over 80 yards and a touchdown. Zach Pascal had 7 catches for over 100 yards and a touchdown. The list just keeps going and going. He had a lot of receivers that played in so many great ways. We'll kind of talk more in depth here of the wide receivers here. I do want to get your opinion on which wide receiver. I know it's difficult because every single one of them played a pivotal role in this, but which one to you made the biggest difference in the game?
Yeah, I'm going to not go with T.Y. Hilton, surprisingly, although he had 6 catches for 70 yards and a touchdown and played fairly well. He was kind of quiet in the first half, and that's kind of the reason why I'm going to go with Zach Pascal. And it's not because T.Y. Hilton was just quiet because Brissett wasn't targeting him, but it was more so that the Texans knew that he was a major threat, and so what they did was they brought in an extra safety or a corner to sort of shadow Hilton and not let him get those one-on-one looks that he so often torches the Texans with. And so Zach Pascal really stepped up on plays where T.Y. Hilton was locked down or wasn't as efficient as we are used to him being, per se. So Zach Pascal, the first receiving touchdown of the game, put the Colts on the board, 7-0, and then he had that shovel pass touchdown. I think the Colts were up 21-16, if my memory serves correctly. But that put the Colts up 28-16, so that was huge. 7 catches, 106 yards. I mean, he really, really stepped up in key moments of the game yesterday, and he deserves major, major credit for his performance.
Yeah, I think it's pretty obvious at this point that for years to come, when the Colts keep breaking down this Colts roster for wide receivers, you know how there was a lot of talk in the offseason about who is going to be left the odd man out. I think now Zach Pascal has pretty much secured his position on this roster for the rest of his career, as long as he keeps doing what he's doing. Because obviously you're going to have T.Y., who in a few years probably will start to see a decline in a few years. I mean, he's getting up there in age. Devin Funchess obviously coming back. Paris Campbell, we don't know what to expect of him yet. Deion Kane, we don't know what to expect of him yet. Zach Pascal has been the only other consistent option for this Colts team, and he's done an amazing job. I think for this game, I as much as I want to go with Zach, I think that's the common answer here. It's very difficult for me between Ebron and T.Y. because I don't know if anyone knows this, but I think every catch that T.Y. Hilton had either resulted in a touchdown or resulted in a first down. T.Y. Hilton is that man. He is that pivotal. But I think the guy that made the crowd get into it more than anyone was Eric Ebron. That was the guy when he made that touchdown. Oh my goodness, that is a potential catch of the year put in right there. And believe me, when he saw it on the board, because he didn't even know, and the fans didn't even know, when he and the crowd saw it on the board, he went out to the middle of the field. He started getting them all hyped because he knew that was the touchdown. That was the big one. And he didn't drop anything today. It was great because we were talking about it, in the previous weeks. Like, is Eric Ebron in jeopardy here? Is Eric Ebron, in the moment here where he doesn't look like he's necessarily in sync with this team right now? And I think he put all of that to bed with this game. I mean, he had a terrific game. Every single catch he had was pivotal. And I know I've been using that word a lot, pivotal, because that's a word that, it was so common because every single time the Colts did so well on third downs. And a lot of these third downs were not third and shorts. They were third down and 7s, third down and 8s, some that were like third down and 12s and 15s, and they were completing these. I mean, who do you even give the nod to on the offense for how this game went? Because I mean, it other than the last 3 drives of the game, which we're going to get into here in a minute, who is the most pivotal to how this team succeeded on offense? Because I mean, obviously the offensive line did amazing, only giving up 1 sack, even though Brissett was hit a lot. I mean, obviously the Texans brought a lot of pressure, and they did a great job of giving Brissett time at multiple occasions, and every receiver did its job. I mean, can we just give like the MVP trophy to everyone on the offense for how they played today?
Absolutely, Derek. We could certainly give an award to everybody on that offensive side of the ball, from Brissett to the offensive line to the receivers. I mean, they all just did a phenomenal job yesterday. But I'm going to give the award to Frank Reich, and I'm going to give it to him for several reasons. First off, let me start with his play calling. We've seen it since he was hired on last year. Frank Reich is one of the best offensive minds in football. He takes advantage of mismatches. He takes advantage, or took advantage, I should say, yesterday, the fact that the Texans were thin in their secondary. He puts receivers and tight ends in a position to win. He calls really, really, really good blocking schemes on certain plays. So he brings in, like, let's say, if the Colts want to go deep, he blocks 6 or 7 people. That way Brissett, or whoever's at quarterback, whether it was Luck last year or Brissett this year, has a clean pocket to step up into. Frank Reich makes this thing go. He deserves a ton of credit. He and Sirianni both deserve a ton of credit for the play calling, for the designs, for the schemes, for getting the receivers open. If you noticed yesterday, the Colts ran a lot of crossing routes because of the Texans secondary and how decimated with injury that it was. I mean, major props to Frank Reich.
We kind of mentioned, or Cody and I mentioned it, how, not all bye weeks are equal. Some teams can take advantage of it. Other teams can't. And the Colts obviously took advantage of their bye week. They had that extra week to prepare for. You give Frank Reich an extra week to prepare for what he wants to do to a team. Believe me, it's going to be much better. And now that we're on the topic of Frank Reich, it's inquisitive that I ask this question, because at the end of the game, we obviously saw the last 3 drives of the Colts get stalled, right? And there was times when they did not take time off the clock because they decided not to run the ball. They decided they were going to throw it. And there was the time, obviously, people mentioned, what about that 4th down? Why we went for it, we didn't get it. Whose fault is that? Well, I don't really necessarily blame Frank for that, because I believe, you need to convert on the plays that you run in regards to that. But in the end, Frank Reich did give Houston a chance to come back in this game in the end. I just wanted to know from your stance, Andrew, how much, because obviously if the Colts had lost this game, ideologically, if they would have lost this game, most of the blame would have been pointed at Frank Reich because of how he handled the play calling at the end of the game. Thankfully, our defense did a great job at the end to keep Deshaun Watson from doing any more damage. But ultimately, since we won, we can look at this objectively. How much blame is Frank Reich to how close this game came to at the end of the game?
That's an interesting question, Derek, and I just praised him in our last little mini segment, if you will. So I'm not gonna harp too much on that, and I'm gonna shift my attention towards the offensive personnel. And what I mean by that is Frank Reich. Yes, he's a phenomenal play designer and play caller, but at the end of the day, the offense's job is to execute. And the Colts certainly have the personnel to do so. And when you have the interception by Pierre Desir and the punt by the Houston Texans that I think didn't really go their way, and you have really good field position on both those ends, and you don't take advantage with at least some sort of points, Frank Reich isn't to blame for that. First of all, give credit to the Texans defense because they did their job, but the offense has to execute. They have to be able to go out there, regardless of who else on the field, and execute and convert on third and longs or convert on key third downs and extend drives and put points on the board. So, as I said, I don't think Frank Reich is really to blame. I think, honestly, he called a really, really solid game, as I mentioned earlier. And the offense, as I mentioned, it's their job to go out and convert and execute.
Yeah, you're right. It goes both ways with that, right? There's obviously, you mentioned we should have ran the ball. We need to get the clock run down, because you don't want to give Deshaun Watson any more time because that defense, and the funny thing is the Colts controlled time of possession in this game. They obviously had a much higher time of possession rating today, which ultimately, again, is how we win these games because we are on the field on offense a lot more than the other team. So I'm not gonna say it's entirely Frank Reich's fault because he called almost a perfect game up until those 3 drives, but it felt almost again like it was an Oakland moment where we just didn't convert on offense on the other end. Even if we didn't even get first downs, it was just about wasting clock. And you're right. The players need to convert. That's your job. You go out there, and especially against a Texans team that was already having troubles in their secondary, you thought it would have been easier. But of course, things didn't work. They didn't convert. Blame goes both ways here. Players should have executed, but the coach should have probably ran the ball because that would have been the smarter thing to do. Sometimes I hate that aggressive nature about Frank Reich in situations like that where you want to play it safe. But anyway, we're going to move on because the defense we haven't given any love yet to. Another example of this Colts bend but don't break mentality. And this was a game. They did not have Tyquan Lewis. They don't have Kimiko Toure off the edge. They don't have Malik Hooker. They don't even have Clayton Geathers really starting. And not to mention Rock Ya-Sin had to come in there and replace Kenny Moore. Rock Ya-Sin had to come in and do the work. And unfortunately, Rock Ya-Sin had a few times Rock Ya-Sin got exposed in coverage. And even when he was beat in coverage, he wasn't really necessarily beat. It was just great throws by Watson to his wide receivers. It's telling how Deshaun Watson can complete 75% of his passes, throw for 320 yards, only have 1 touchdown, and have 2 interceptions. And 2 interceptions that were pivotal at the end of the game. And not to mention the instances that Frank Reich and the offense put them in the first half, right? We saw the first one where they didn't convert the 4th down. The Texans had the ball at the 47-yard line on our side, and we kept them to a field goal. The next drive, Jacoby Brissett fumbles the ball, and it's inside the 5-yard line. We stopped them for 3 straight plays, and they have to kick a field goal. That is impressive, especially and that's where Darius Leonard came in. Darius Leonard is that vocal leader. The defense is just more tenacious, and they're just more aggressive when Darius Leonard's on the field, I swear. And the corners were doing a great job of actually dropping down into the first section of the coverage and making tackles in the open field. I thought we actually did a really good job of tackling in the open field. I don't know where a lot of people got the bad tackling from in this, but we'll talk about that here in a second. But what did you make, Andrew, of this defense? Because to me, they looked very, very impressive.
I completely agree, Derek. The defense was more than spectacular yesterday. I mean, you look at those 2 4th down stops inside the 5-yard line, holding Houston to just 6 points total on those 2 drives, especially the one where the Texans recovered the fumble of Jacoby Brissett, as you mentioned, inside the 5-yard line. Those were key. I think you could call them turning points in the game. I know you're talking, I think, late first, early second quarter, but it's those kind of plays, in the trenches when it really, really, really counts. And the Colts defense stood up and did their job. Major kudos to the defensive personnel as well as Matt Eberflus and that defensive coaching staff. Darius Leonard, of course, 10 tackles, the game-sealing interception, as we've mentioned already. he saved the game for the Colts, and I like I said, I completely agree. The defense played very, very, very well, and the Colts should be very pleased, not only with their efforts from this week, but over the last several weeks defensively.
Yeah. It was really crazy to see how that game ended with Darius Leonard being the one to bring us home. How amazing is that story to come back after 3 weeks of having a concussion, being so amped up and ready to play in this game, and to essentially win the game by your doing, kind of like how Malik Hooker did it with the Jaguars last year. I wanted to kind of talk about the defensive line because, again, it was another day where the numbers can be a little misleading, where the pressure on Watson was not necessarily great, but the times when the Colts actually got pressure and sacked Watson came at the most pivotal moments in the game, where the first sack, obviously, they sacked Watson in that drive where the Colts had went for the fourth down, didn't get it, and the Texans were driving, and then they sacked him there, basically to end up forcing the long field goal. And then we obviously saw the controversial sack where the ref had blown the play dead because they said his forward momentum had stopped, and he was in a position where they didn't want to expose him to a really bad hit. Before I go any more into that, did you think that was the right call, or do you think that should have been a play where they should have let Watson just continue going and eventually having Hopkins get the touchdown?
That's an interesting question, Derek. Yeah, looking back on it now, I think it was the right call. Listen, there are rules in this game, in the NFL that are meant to be there to protect the quarterback. And when you have a player that is as elusive as Deshaun Watson and who is essentially known for taking broken plays and making them into something special, as a general NFL fan, I could see why maybe they'd want to see a play like that let go or continue, if you will. But at the end of the day, if you look at the angle that Deshaun Watson was taking when he released the ball, and the defender that was going to essentially sack him, the official, Tony Correnti, I believe, who it was, made the appropriate call and really saved Deshaun Watson from taking an unnecessary hit, which, reflecting on it or thinking about it now, he's taken a lot of those over the last couple of years. He was sacked the most last year, close to the most a couple of years ago, or the year before, I should say, excuse me. So when you look at a player like Watson who has had injuries due to the amount of hits he has taken, you would think that Texans fans and maybe even some NFL fans, in general, would be appreciative of the fact that the play was blown dead. Was it a great play? Yes. Could it have gone either way? Yes. Would I have wanted them to have blown the play dead had it been on the other side of things, in terms of had that been Jacoby Brissett? Absolutely. I wouldn't want my quarterback, especially one like Watson, who has been prone to some injuries due to unnecessary hits, taking that kind of hit in that kind of way.
Yeah, and that's kind of where we're at in this day and age, right? We want to protect the quarterback because, let's face it, the quarterback makes a team flow so much better, the guy that's number one. And we've already seen so many guys retire and get hurt and all these other things that are dropping quarterbacks in the NFL like crazy this year. And of course, you don't want to have, Deshaun Watson, who's been one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL this season. You obviously don't want that to happen to him. And I think you're right that I understand where the ref was coming from. Obviously, I understand he wants to protect the guy. He wants to make sure he's okay. I completely understand it. Me personally, I would have let that play keep going because I just like, you know what, I'm just going to let him do it. But of course, again, I understand where they're coming from. I would say the same thing if that's if that was Brissett in that situation. And going back to the sacks thing, we obviously I mentioned how Danico Autry got the that big pivotal pressure up the middle late in the fourth quarter that stopped Deshaun Watson from getting the first down, basically blocked that. And there was a couple more sacks by Justin Houston and a few others later in the game as well. Again, it wasn't a spectacular performance by the D-line in the pass rushing category, but in the moments that they needed a sack, they really did come through and made the sacks. And you're right, they took advantage of the right tackle being gone, and they did a really good job of not letting Carlos Hyde or Duke Johnson do anything in the run game. There were 2 drives when Carlos Hyde and Duke Johnson were able to get runs, and that was when the Texans went into their called it a quick offense. They didn't necessarily go into a huddle, but they were going quick. They were trying to make sure that the Colts didn't have time to adjust. And that was when they were getting those holes. But when they didn't do that, the Colts just did not allow the Texans to get anything. It was just so great to see that over the last 2 weeks, the Colts have really just taken a step back and realized they had to get better in the run defense. Obviously, having Jabal Sheard back obviously helps that. But new guys coming in and getting pressure up the gut, like Marcus Hunt and Grover Stewart getting more playing time, it is really great to see this Colts defense taking the initiative to get better at things they struggled with the first 4 weeks.
There's no question about it, Derek. I mean, when you look at the first 2 weeks against the Chargers and Titans, the Colts pass rush essentially lived in the backfield those 2 games. And then you look at the games against Atlanta and Oakland, we went from living in the backfield to non-existent, to just not getting the kind of rush that we had those first 2 weeks. And it was a major concern, rightfully so, going into the game against Kansas City and then today's game against Houston. But I will say this, they stepped up when the Colts needed them most, and they got to Watson in the trenches and forced a couple of bad throws, 2 of which resulted in interceptions, one of which was the game-sealing interception. So it's not necessarily always about getting sacks, but it's about getting pressure. Frank Reich and Chris Ballard have said it from day one. It starts up front, and if you can get pressure up front with your defensive line, then it's going to possibly result in some really great things for you. And yesterday was a prime example of that. So kudos to the defensive line.
Absolutely. And I was to quickly go back to Jacoby Brissett here, just kind of looking at the numbers, and with those 4 touchdown passes that Jacoby Brissett has, he is tied for 3rd in touchdown passes this season right now, with Patrick Mahomes having 15 and Matt Ryan having 15. And then it says there are 2 guys that have 14 touchdowns so far. And this is before Russell Wilson is playing right now. So I'm sure Russell Wilson's touchdown number is going to go up after this. But Russell Wilson and Jacoby Brissett are tied for 2nd with that. So I'm sure Russell Wilson's probably going to take the lead on that in this. But again, it just goes to show just how, and I hate to go back to Brissett here again, I'm taking away from everything else, but it's just amazing to see Jacoby Brissett doing what he's doing. I mean, he only has 3 interceptions on the year, has 14 touchdowns, and of course we have to take into account he's fumbled the ball twice. Unfortunately, he obviously had that one in week 1 or week 2 when they played the Titans, where it was unbelievably hot outside and the ball just slipped out of his hand accidentally, and obviously the fumble today, but still a great thing to see from Brissett. And I think one thing that I didn't mention before with Brissett is when he read the defenses that he was doing, he threw the ball with some determination. The broadcasters actually mentioned how they said you could almost hear the ball being ripped out of Brissett's hands to throw to some of those wide receivers. And we obviously know Brissett's got a cannon of an arm. We know he can sling that thing if he wants to. I just think, again, going back to the confidence thing I was mentioning, it just has to feel amazing to know that Brissett went into that with so much calmness and confidence. He was slinging the ball around like crazy. It must have felt really good for you to see, for me to see, and for all of Colts Nation to see that.
Absolutely, Derek. It was phenomenal to see. I mean, the 326 yards, the 69% completion percentage, the 4 touchdowns. Brissett put on an absolute clinic yesterday, and he is continuing to prove to this organization that he is our next franchise quarterback. And I know I mentioned this way earlier in the podcast, and I don't certainly want to jump to any sort of conclusions, but the man has 14 touchdowns to 3 interceptions on the season. He's got well over 1,000 yards. He is lighting the league up, and quite frankly, I think he's in nothing short of the MVP conversation. When you look at the other quarterbacks, Matt Ryan, although the Falcons aren't doing very well, Russell Wilson has been playing lights out. You look at Patrick Mahomes. I mean, I think he's 3rd or 4th in the league when it comes to all 4 of those guys in terms of touchdowns. That doesn't happen by accident. This kid can play, and he's played very, very well. And so kudos to the Indianapolis Colts for believing in Brissett. Chris Ballard said it the night Luck retired. We're not going to flinch. We know what we have in Brissett. We know what we have in terms of our personnel and our head coach. And we're going to continue to live up to the Colts Nation mantra, if you will. We're going to continue to win games. We're going to continue to show people that although Andrew Luck was an important piece, he wasn't the piece, if you will. He wasn't the only piece that resulted in Colts wins last season. So kudos to Jacoby Brissett. I feel I'm really, really happy for him. And I think that if he continues to play the way he's playing and he has a phenomenal season, like I said, I think we're looking at our next franchise quarterback. I really do.
It's quite possible, man. If he can keep having some more of these games, even if he's not, I think we can definitely put in faith in hands that he's not going to lose us games. And ultimately, that's all we need, is that we just need that quarterback that's going to help us win games and not lose it, because this roster is already so dynamic and so young, and Jacoby Brissett fits that narrative. And it is great to see him doing what he's done. All right. Well, I think that's it for this episode here. That was our recap of the Texans and the Colts. Again, Colts win 30-23 over the Texans. The Colts take sole leadership of the AFC South going into next week, where they play the Broncos at home as well. We will get back to that here later this week for a preview on that. Thank you guys so much. Andrew, do you have any final words?
It's just a great team win. Looking forward to hopefully many more this season, and I'm excited to see where we end up going. Thanks for having me on as always, Derek. Go Colts.
Absolutely. And get next week we got a chance to go 1-0. It's pretty much it. All right, guys, thank you so much for tuning in. Appreciate the support as always. And as always, guys, go Colts.